Thank you for joining us, everybody. My name is Mike Mitchell, class of 2007 graduate from Salem State. I serve as Assistant Director of Alumni Relations here at the university. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We've got a terrific panel of legal professionals that we're excited to speak with and learn more about the work that they do. Before we get started and get into the presentation, I do just want to remind all of our viewers that this program is for information purposes only. None of the commentary you hear tonight should be considered legal advice or guidance of any kind. And if you do have personal matters, I would certainly advise you to take those up with a legal professional obtained by you on your own time. Now that we've got the legal out of the way, let's take a moment and introduce our panelists who are joining us tonight. First, please welcome from the class of 1996, Stefani Field. Stefani, good evening.
Good evening.
And if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment, introducing yourself and the firm that you are working with today.
Sure. So my name is Stefani Field. I graduated from Salem State in 1996, and I work with the law offices of Gold, Albany, Sparletti, and Locascio in Boston. I have been there in some capacity since 1997 and practicing law there since 2003. I run our Boston office here in the financial district, but we also have firms in New Jersey, and of counsel in New York. We're mostly a general practice firm, but we do handle both plaintiff and defense cases. And the bulk of my cases these days tend to be for insurance defense cases, representing insurance companies in their insureds in various litigation cases. So that's what we do.
Great. Thank you, Stefani. And next up, I'd like to introduce Rita Colucci.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rita Colucci. I'm actually the general counsel for Salem State. I've been with Salem State for about 3 years now. Prior to that time, I was with one of our sister state universities, also on the general counsel role, plus wearing a couple of other hats. So I'm in-house, and what's considered in-house in my practice is all higher education. But when you're in-house, you also tend to wear a lot of different hats. I'm involved in a lot of things that you might not think the lawyer would be present for, but that's kind of the nature of being in-house counsel.
Great, thank you, Rita. Next, I'd like to introduce Jesse Fermin from the class of 2018.
Hi, everyone. Jesse Fermin, as Mike mentioned, class of 2018. I recently started at a firm in the financial district as well, Wilson, Cincinnati, Goodrich, and Rosati. We are a full spectrum firm. So we do anything from general corporate to intellectual property, which is a practice that I'm in. We have about 16 offices nationwide with some international presence in Beijing, Brussels, London, and Shanghai. So yeah, I'm excited to talk to everyone.
Thank you, Jesse. And next up, let me introduce Mike Monteforte from the class of 1998.
Right. Hi, everybody. So I am Mike Monteforte, class of 98. My wife is also class of 1998. We met at Salem State. So Salem State is a really important place in my heart. My firm is Monteforte Law PC. We're out of Woburn, Mass. We've been, I've been a lawyer for 20 years. I've been out on my own since 2006. So right around 15 years as far as having my own practice. We're a boutique firm. We specialize in estate planning, elder planning, and Medicaid planning. So we have, we're a niche practice. We specialize in just one particular type of law. It wasn't always the case. We've kind of become that over the last several years. We just moved to a new space over in Woburn, so that's where we are now. I've got 4 on staff. I'm the only attorney. We're actually hiring an associate attorney now, so we will have one more shortly. And the firm is just my name. It doesn't have this whole big bunch of names. Like, you guys are making me sound small time with all these names and Beijing and that, this and that. We're out of Woburn. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. And last but certainly not least, from the class of 1989, Mr. Lou George.
Yes, class of 1989. So hello everybody. My name's Lou George. I'm from the class of '89, and I'm a lawyer with the Social Security Administration Office of the General Counsel in Boston. I'm an assistant regional counsel there. So I'm a government lawyer. I've been there, been with Social Security since 2015. I've been a lawyer though for 28 years, since 1992. And I've spent my entire legal career in either the government or the public interest side. So before coming to Social Security, I worked for a veteran service organization in Washington, D.C. For about 16 years. And before that, I spent some time with the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington. And I started my career at with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in Boston. Actually, I worked for the Big Dig, the Central Artery Tunnel Project, as in their in-house counsel's office. So again, it's sort of as Rita was mentioning, with Social Security OGC, we are in-house in a way. So that's one of our jobs. We represent the agency in a variety of areas, including, for example, labor and employment law. But we also, most of the bread and butter of what we do is litigation dealing with Social Security appeals before the federal district and the courts of appeal. So it's definitely, it's an interesting area of the law. It's a variety. I also, I graduated from Salem State, and I have a family with a Salem State lineage. My parents both graduated from Salem State class of '56 and class of '53, and I have a nephew and a niece who are both students there, and I have a sister who graduated there. So the ties run deep.
Thank you, Lou. And again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And I want to encourage those folks that are watching along. If you have questions, throw them in the question and answer box and we'll deliver them to the panelists as they come in. But now we get into kind of a little bit more free-flowing portion of the program. So I'll throw this out there to the panel first. And it's always probably a question that everybody imagines will come first in these kinds of situations. But tell us a little bit about how you ended up in your current roles and what made you decide to want to get into the work that you're currently doing. And I'll throw it to anybody out there first.
I'll go first. So I finished undergrad in 2018, and the idea was to go right to law school. But then I was talking to some folks in the field, and they advised that I kind of get my feet wet first to make sure that that's something that I really wanted to do. And so I began at Foley and Lardner in the healthcare practice as a legal assistant, supporting 5 attorneys. And that was nice, but it definitely reassured me in my decision of not wanting to go to law school. And, there are so many careers in law. You don't have to, practice to be a legal professional. But I started there, and then a year and some change after a change of pace, I got into intellectual property at Choate, which is patents and innovation. So I work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies, as well as like the big tech companies. Some of my clients are like Tesla, TikTok, Memorial Sloan, Regeneron, like some of those names that you all are probably familiar with. And then, after some time at Cho, I now transitioned over to Wilson Sonsini, where I'll be doing the same work and, staying in patents and intellectual property. But I never thought I'd be in this field of work. I've always wanted to kind of work in like criminal justice, social justice issues. But I think, as you get exposed to many different individuals with many different interests, you kind of peak what you may be interested in. And at my time at Foley during healthcare, I had a friend who was in the IP space, and she kind of lured me in, and that's where I got to where I am. So I deal with filing in foreign jurisdictions as opposed to US.
So Jesse, a question just came in. What particular aspects made you decide that you didn't want to pursue law school?
Money. Money was the first one. It gets more and more expensive each day. But also, I didn't want to take on such a heavy workload just right after my undergrad. It sounds nice on paper, but it's not heavily advised. And I thank myself and others for telling me that, because now that I have professional work experience, I kind of see, at least on the corporate level, of how folks, maneuver day in and day out, and most of them are pulling their hair out, again, because corporate is corporate. But I think it was great. It's great to see that, to know that that's not the kind of mental space I want to be in, or, I just don't want to endure that sort of, that mental baggage. I mean, it's nice in the end, but I think in the long run, it's kind of not where I want to be. But I applaud everyone who's done it and who's doing it, and everyone on this call too, whether you're practicing or a legal professional. It's hats off to you. I cannot do it.
Thanks, Jesse. And I'll offer anybody else an opportunity to talk about how you got to where you are.
I'll jump in if you don't mind. No, Stephanie, go ahead. You go ahead. Go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, well, I was just listening to Jesse's story, and it's interesting to me because I kind of had the opposite experience of Jesse. I had always wanted to be a lawyer growing up, and it was just something I always had an interest in. I loved reading, I loved writing, I loved learning about the law. And then I kind of took the long route. And while I was at Salem State, I got my degree in criminal justice, which I loved. And so part of me still thought, well, maybe I'll go into criminal law at some point. But I wasn't real certain about it. So what I ended up doing was getting into the social work spectrum. I worked at a homeless shelter for teen moms here in the city of Lynn. And I mean, it was such a rewarding experience. And I am still in contact with a lot of those, no longer teenagers. They're now grown women in their 40s. But I also knew at that time that that's not kind of where I wanted to go in the future. So I ended up taking a job that I found through a friend of a friend, just as a secretary, believe it or not, at a law firm in Boston, which happens to be the same law firm I'm at. And, he was working as the managing attorney in our Boston office, because like I told you earlier, we have firms in New Jersey, and that's where the senior partners operate out of. And I started just assisting him and kind of, dealing with the day-to-day goings of a practice. And at that point, I was like, still thinking about whether or not I wanted to go into law. And so what I ended up doing was getting a paralegal certificate. And I got that paralegal certificate. And as I was going through that process, I'm like, why are you putting off what is clearly the inevitable? Like, I always wanted to go to law school, and now I'm working at a law firm, and now I'm in a paralegal program. And, the senior partners, who to this day are actually very good friends of mine and have been huge mentors in my life, kind of said, take the next step. This is what you wanted to do. And I did. And, I went to school. I went to law school at nights. I, did as much as I could, and I was able to complete it in 3.5 years. And so it's interesting to hear Jesse's story about like discovering that that's not what he ultimately wanted to do. And for me, it was kind of the turning point for me that kind of lit the fire for me. Like, no, this is what you wanted to do, so do it. And I did. And I've been very, very lucky to be at this firm. I started out at this law office as a secretary. I became a paralegal, and I've been practicing law now almost 18 years. And I run our Boston office, and it's been really, really interesting for me, because even though I have the senior partners and their support, and like I said, they've been huge mentors for me, I was thrust into the practice of law, and kind of had to manage my way through everything. The thing for me, the quote I used to always say was like, read the rule, read the rule. As lawyers, we know there's so many rules. And I'm kind of proud of myself that I was able to do that, kind of just being thrown into the mix. So, my story is definitely different from Jesse, but I can see both sides of it. And, it's wonderful that he was able to actually be in the field, and do what he's doing without, taking that leap if he wasn't so sure.
Mike, I know you wanted to add something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's funny just from hearing both of you, because Jesse's story resonated with me, because I knew I was going to be a lawyer, and I went through on a pretty straight shot, but I definitely ended up in a different field of law than what I ever expected to. As Stephanie had mentioned, she was a criminal justice major. I was a criminal justice major at Salem State as well, except it taught me that I knew I did not want to be a criminal lawyer. So that's probably the biggest, some of the advice I give people when trying to figure out what you want to do is knowing what you don't want to do. And, I enjoyed the curriculum, the criminal justice curriculum, but I knew from that I didn't want to be a criminal attorney and that I was going to have to figure something else out. As I mentioned, my wife and I met in '96. We're both graduates of '98. So when we graduated college, we knew at that point we were going to, be on the way to getting married and having a family. So I had to get my butt in gear and, go. If I was going to go to school, I had to do it right away because I needed to figure out a way to make money. So I went straight from Salem State on to law school. And I worked at a small firm in Lynn, both as a student and then when I eventually graduated, they hired me as an attorney there. And I stayed on there for 6 years. I worked for a couple of lawyers, small firm, both family guys, both very successful, but at the same time maintained that kind of work-life balance. And I learned from them that, that was the life that I wanted. I kind of figured out early on that big firm life wasn't really for me. They were general practitioners. They kind of taught me how to run a business. And when I maxed out there and they were paying me as much as they could possibly pay me, I decided to go out on my own. So I went out on my own in 2006, general practice. Anybody that called, I would sit there and stare at the phone and beg it to ring, and whatever anybody called asking for, hey, do you do this? Oh yeah, I do it all the time. I'm great at it. And as soon as they hang up, I'm running to the books trying to figure out, what the hell I just, said I would do. So I ran a general practice for a long time. I started doing a lot of real estate work. It was paying the bills, but I didn't love it. And I really wasn't sure, whether I wanted to stay in general practice or whether I wanted to niche down in some way. And that's where kind of fate stepped in a little bit. My grandparents, who I was very close with, big, loud Italian family. My grandfather got sick. He started suffering from dementia. And it was time for he and my grandmother to move into an assisted living facility. And at that time, my family was looking at me saying, well, what do we do? They worked, slaved all their lives, made some money, and now they're going to pay all their money to this, facility. Is there anything, what do we do about it? And I'm the only lawyer in my family. And I said, how the hell should I know? I don't know what to do. I do real estate. So I figured out that I needed to learn how to do that type of work because I wanted to try and help my grandparents. And so I dove head first into that, learned everything I could about it, took every class, read every book. And figured out that, number one, I enjoyed the work. I found it very, very interesting. There was an ability there for me to help my own family, but at the same time, there was a need for it. Lots of folks that are, again, going into nursing homes or assisted living facilities and losing their, all their money that they've worked and saved for their whole lives. But a lot of that can be prevented with the right planning. So I really decided at that point I was going to cut everything else out of my practice and focus solely on estate planning and elder planning. So that's what I do now. It's all I do. To be good at it, it's really something that you have to specialize in because there's so much to it. It's in constant state of flux. So that's where I am, and I love it. I really get to help people on an individual level or help families able to take a lot of the weight off their shoulders and kind of ease their burdens. So that's, a great part of my day. And that part of it is really rewarding. At the same time, I get to be the boss and make the rules and come and go as I please. So, I mean, it's 6 o'clock and I'm home. We close at 5, People that do litigation and that sort of thing don't always have that opportunity, but in my practice, I do. We work till 8 to 5, and at 5 o'clock, I'm out the door, and I'm home 15 minutes later. So that's where I am now. I enjoy it, but I never expected, 15 years ago, oh, Mike, you're going to practice in elder law. I would have said, no way. That's, that's too boring. If you ask my daughter now, she maybe wants to be a lawyer, but she thinks what I do is boring. So, who knows? I find it interesting, but I never would have guessed that's where I was going to end up. But that's where I am.
I wanted to jump in if I could.
Sure. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. I just want to sort of kind of give my little, and again, it's always interesting hearing, hearing people's stories in terms of how they ended up where they are. And before I said anything, I almost forgot. I should have said at the outset. This comes from me working for the federal government. Anything I say tonight are my own words and don't represent the views of the federal government or the Social Security Administration. So we'll move on from there. But I had sort of a bit of a circuitous route getting to to where I am now. I graduated from Salem State in '89. I was a geography major. I was an urban geography major, studied land use and urban planning. And I did have an interest in law, though, sort of stemming. I remember I took a history course with Professor Fox, who recently passed away. And I remember studying the Army McCarthy hearings. And I was really struck by the attorney for the Army, Joseph Welch, who was an attorney at Hale and Gore, old white shoe firm in Boston, who represented the Army. And through his words and actions, really sort of helped. I mean, he was known for saying, Senator, have you left no sense of decency, during the Army McCarthy hearings, defending one of his young associates who McCarthy and Roy Cohn were sort of trying to get during the course of the hearings. So I always had a bit of an interest in the law. I took a internship between my junior and senior year at the Attorney General's office. I was a complaint mediator. So it was in the Consumer Protection Division. And so if you had a complaint before going to small claims court, you could have your claim mediated, and you'd have these like knucklehead college students who didn't know anything to go and help mediate it. But I found it struck me was interesting was because you got to, and this is what I like about the practice of law, is that you get to learn about a lot of different things. I still remember a case I mediated involving a driveway. Someone had their driveway paved, and apparently the contractor made a mistake, and they drove the car in on a hot day, and the tires started to sink in the driveway. So I had to figure out what happened here. So I had to call this is before the internet, so you had to call people and find out how many layers are there in a driveway, and was able to figure out that there was missing one of the layers, that the contractor skipped a step, and that was the problem. So I got to be over the course of a couple of days, I got to be an expert on driveways. So I just found I found that interesting. I ended up going to law school right from, so after that experience, I took the LSATs. I ended up going to law school. I went straight from undergrad to law school. I went to school in DC, and in DC, there's a lot of government work. So I ended up sort of gravitating to the government sector. So I ended up working, I had a summer internship at the U.S. Department of Transportation for, of all things, the Board for Correction of Military Records of the Coast Guard, which was this little board that they handled military justice, military personnel issues. And I just found that it was interesting because it was people law. It was law that affected individuals. I mean, this was someone who might have had a less than honorable discharge or some sort of problems where they weren't able to get VA benefits. And so the board had a pretty broad charge to correct any sort of error or injustice. And during that time too, in the early 90s, there were issues dealing with, there were issues in the military dealing with sexual harassment, racial discrimination, that sort of thing. So it gave you kind of a good idea of what law could do, that you could really help sort of make things right. And so then ultimately over time, I ended up going back up to Boston. I worked in sort of an in-house capacity for about 4 years for the Big Dig. Did a lot of work like in the labor and employment area, contracts and such as well. Like there was a project labor agreement that they had. Interested in going back down to DC. So then I ended up going back down to DC, and I worked for the federal government again, worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs at their Board of Veterans Appeals dealing with veterans cases. And so then I went from there to a veteran service organization. So I went from working for the government finished up work on a Friday, and then Monday, I ended up suing the government, which was sort of an interesting bit of it was a bit of a twist. So you were representing veterans in their cases before the VA. And I worked there it was a small veterans organization for about a little over 15 years. And I was there, and again, even though it's a veterans area, it's all sort of under sort of administrative law. So you're dealing with appeals of, adverse government decisions, before, federal court. I knew I was not, that most of what we did was more appellate style case, so I was not in court. You're in court on a, somewhat on a, basis, but not regularly, and it wasn't trial work. So it wasn't like you're in, in court every day. I had that experience in law school. I mean, definitely encourage people to, if you're in law school, I did a clinical program where I represented people in landlord-tenant court who were being evicted. And that's where I learned I didn't necessarily want to be a trial lawyer, because I realized that you could have the best case ever, but if your judge was hungry, bored, just in a bad mood, you could have the best case and you probably could lose. So anyway, so I was with the Veterans Organization. I was interested ultimately in going back up to in the Boston area. Convinced my wife that that we should who did not grow up on the North Shore, that we should move up to New England, move back to Danvers. And so I've been with Social Security since then. So there's definitely some interplay between the VA and Social Security. I found out about this position actually that I'm in through a former colleague who I worked with in the veteran sector. And so and so where I am now, we mostly deal with court work, dealing with Social Security benefits, but we also we do in-house. So we work with, we work on labor and employment issues, Social Security employees who may file claims like with the EEOC or the Merit Systems Protection Board. It's a pretty large office. We have about 25 attorneys. So there's a good amount of mentoring we get to do as well. So we have interns that come in. I'm one of the co-coordinators of our intern program. And so it's definitely, it's an interesting mix of work. And again, it's sort of kind of going to the original theme of when I was even first, in law school. The work that we do, it's people art, it affects individuals, even though in this side, I'm on the government side, so it may be defending a decision that is denying someone's benefits, potentially. You're still looking at, at someone's claim, someone's life really, that you're working on a case. And we also, one thing I do like about the work as well, even though we represent the government, we don't have a win at all costs, defend at all costs mentality. So if we look at a case, if we look and see that, for example, an administrative law judge made a mistake, didn't do quite the right thing, we have the ability to send the case back, correct the mistakes, try to get things done right. So that's sort of what we, so that's a little bit of a summary of what I've been doing.
Thanks, Luke. Go ahead, Rita.
Yeah, happy to jump in. So I really enjoyed hearing everybody's stories, and I think it hits home what's so great about a legal degree is that there's so much versatility there, right? You don't know where you're going to end up unless you have a real specific plan. But the possibilities are endless. And so I always love to hear other lawyer stories because they're just so interesting. But I want to give a shout out to Jesse. I think what you did was really the right thing. You kind of tried out the career, and that's what I think. Particularly if you are thinking of going to law school, that's such a smart thing to do because it is so expensive, and it's a commitment of time. Stephanie said she went through night school in 3.5 years, and everybody needs to be very impressed with that because that is really hard to do. The regular track is 4 years full time. So to do it only part time and do it, it's 3 years full time. So to do it in 3.5 years part time is really incredible. But so my story is, it's interesting, right? Sometimes you just fall into things. I took 1.5 years off after undergraduate school, wasn't sure what I wanted to do, thought, let me go to law school because that's a good degree to have. Never really wanted to be a lawyer. And then, once you're in, you kind of get sucked into the legal world. And I thought, oh, this is kind of fun. But one day I was, hanging around the school, and one of my professors came up to me and he said, hey, do you need a job? And I think I was a third-year student at the time. And I said, yeah, of course I need a job, right? I always needed a job. And he said, well, the MBTA they need an intern in their labor relations department. Are you interested? And I didn't know what labor relations was. I had no idea what this was about. And I said, yeah, sure, of course I'm interested. So I went to the New England School of Law, and the MBTA offices were literally right across the street. So, it was really convenient. Anyway, I started working in their labor relations unit, which is basically the office that deals with all the labor unions and labor issues. And the MBTA is, 98% unionized. So we were a really busy office, had a lot of work, a lot of attorneys. And after I graduated, I eventually was hired as a staff attorney there, and spent the first 5 years after law school doing labor law in employee law, personnel law. And that really served as the basis for my career going forward. Like every job I've had since then has had an element of labor and employment to it. And every job I took, which I won't bore you with, but just kind of built on that foundation, I guess I would say. So you never know where those internships are going to lead you. And you just, I mean, some people have a real plan in mind. And then other people kind of take it as it comes, right? And I was probably part of the latter.
Great, thank you, Rita. So I think it's nice to hear 5. They seem to be how you got to where you are somewhat similar in nature, but the areas that you're all in are vastly different, as we've just learned, right? So a couple questions have come in. Some are similar in nature, so I'll kind of put them together. A couple of questions about advice for anybody who's interested in getting into the legal field that may not have any kind of necessarily relevant experience to start, and then either in your travels through law school or now as professionals, for those folks that may have concerns about the cost of attending law school, if you know of any resources that are out there to help students kind of afford those opportunities, I would throw that out there to the group as well.
I'll jump in on the affordability factor. Over the years, because I've worked in higher ed for a while, I would have students thinking about law school come and talk to me. And the first thing I always said was, how are you going to pay for it? Because, saying you're going to take out loans to pay for your entire law school education is probably not the wisest way to go about it. There's a lot more financial aid in law schools now than there was when I was a student. I went to law school from 89 to 91, so it was a really long time ago. But there was like no financial aid at the time other than loans. So, I would advise people, apply, see what the school will give you. Law school applications are down now, and so law schools need students. So they're eager to have you apply. And then there's other programs that you can look into. Like I think it's Army JAG, where you can go and basically work for the military as an attorney, which is a great way to get experience once you get out. And I'm not sure if there's loan forgiveness, it's something like that. And there's also, if you're interested in the nonprofit legal services world, I think that there are programs out there as well that, again, if you commit a few years after law school to work, there are places, you'll have some loan forgiveness. So there's options. You just have to kind of do your research and keep your eyes open.
I just want to jump in if I could, just in terms of the, similarly, in terms of, I've known people who've gone into JAG, who've gone to the military, which is a great experience. I mean, I did not do it myself, but I've known people who did, and it's also a great opportunity to also, between JAG as well as the federal sector or working in the nonprofit world, of loan forgiveness. A lot of my sort of the newer lawyers who I work with are part of that, so they're getting their loans forgiven for doing government service. So that's definitely, and and just sort of respond also to the question if people are just interested sort of in testing the waters and all. I'd recommend too, if you can get involved in like the American Bar Association, or state bar associations. I was very involved in the ABA, and the ABA you can join as I checked it just today, and you can join as a college student, non-lawyer, for free. And so it may cost you a little bit to be involved in sections, but that gives you some exposure to the material. You can go and watch some, continuing legal education seminars or other conferences. And frankly, when COVID is, hopefully a little more under control, there are meet and greets. There are opportunities to meet people. So that's definitely something. And find out what, because I found out that was a good thing even before I went to law school. I talked to some, it's good to talk to some lawyers and find out sort of what they do, how they got to where they are, sort of what's going on today.
I would say just to jump in, you know, if there's a real interest there for somebody about pursuing a career in law, you know, a lot of people worry, well, you know, I have a degree in this, or, you know, I majored in geology. You know, I'm not quite sure that that's going to prepare me for law school. And, you know, when I was in law school, I went to Mass School of Law in Andover. And what was interesting to me when I was in that program is there were police officers there. There were people that had degrees, you know, in things that you wouldn't think somebody in law school would have. You know, I had a degree in criminal justice, and kind of I was laughing about what Michael said earlier about not practicing criminal law. I don't practice criminal law. I've done a few minor criminal law cases when I first started practicing, and decided right away that as much as I love criminal law and you could catch me watching, you know, high profile trials on court TV, I prefer civil litigation and civil trials. But, you know, so I wouldn't be discouraged by, you know, worrying about what you had your degree in. You know, and the other thing too is that, you know, take a job as a clerk, take a job as a paralegal. I started out as a secretary. You know, hands-on experience is so important, and it kind of gives you an overview of, you know, what you can expect if you decide to go to law school. And in terms of affordability, one of the things I always like to say, and I've had law clerks throughout the years, you know, talking about law school and whether or not they wanted to go to law school. And they were very worried about, well, if I don't go to a Harvard, or I don't go to a, you know, really top-notch law school, I'm never going to get a job. And I can't tell you, and I'm sure everybody here would agree, how untrue that is. It's just not true. You know, for me, my experience at Mass School of Law was amazing. I met wonderful people, and it really felt like I was part of a community. And you know what? It's Mass School of Law, and I passed the bar exam, and I'm practicing law, and I think I've done pretty good for myself. So all those things that, you know, might discourage you all out there from, you know, taking it a step further, I just, you know, there are ways to go about it, and there are ways to get your feet wet, and, you know, don't be, you know, stuck on the hype, so to speak, about the law school experiences and where you should be going.
I'll chime in on that, and I agree. Like, Stephanie's right. Once you get out into the field, no one cares where you went to school. I mean, if you're going to one of these top schools, maybe that's going to help you land a guaranteed job when you walk out the door. But the reality is that there's jobs out there for everybody, regardless of what school you went to, when you find, you know, the place that's best for you. No one cares. No one asks me. I mean, I'm doing this 20 years. No one comes in and asks me where I went to school. And I went to Suffolk Law in Boston, and I mean, I have the diploma on the wall, but no one comes in and looks at it. No one cares. You know, the money thing, you know, when I went, I was in law school from 98 to 2001. There was not a lot of financial aid available then. I had to take loans. And I mean, when I graduated, I was 25, and it took me until I was 40 to pay them off. So, I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it. That was the reality, but I managed to work and have a family and pay my loans. So, I mean, I got it done. It was great once I was finally finished. But it took me until I was 40 to do so. I will say that as far as ways of trying to get some experience in the law, and when I was at Salem State, part of the curriculum my senior year was that we were required to do an internship. And it was part of their curriculum. It was required to graduate. And I said, okay, if I need to do this anyway, I'm going to try and do this in a way that, you know, is going to help me. I ended up interning at the State House for a senator, and I was watching, you know, legislation being made, and it was great. It was a really good experience for me. It really helped solidify kind of what I wanted to do with my life. But there are always lawyers and law firms out there looking for somebody that's going to come in and be able to work for free, believe me. So if it's part of your curriculum to do an internship, and you're interested in law, get an internship in the field. There are always lawyers looking. Come see me. I'll put you to work as an intern. We're always looking for somebody that'll do work for us for nothing. So if you have an opportunity to do that as part of your undergrad, especially, it's a great way to get experience.
Great, thanks everyone. And so I think one of the nice things about presentations like this is that the conversations tend to flow very organically from what one prepared question would be to another, and we've seen that tonight. One that just recently came in a few minutes ago. You've all mentioned things that you really enjoy about what you're doing. This question is, what's the hardest part about the law or work that you practice?
Okay, so I don't practice, but I see it hand in hand, and I can touch upon a little about like what's the hardest part for me, and I think the hardest part for the attorneys. Um, I think for me, in everything in intellectual property is deadline driven, um, and your day to day does not is not ever the same. So like you have your docket, which is a report of all that you need to do, and it has your deadlines, and it has um, 1 month reminder, 2 week reminder, 1 week reminder, 2 day, 1 day, and then stat. Um, so I think for me, the hardest part is when you have a workload of like 70 clients, you have to make sure that you're just paying attention. And as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of what I do involves foreign jurisdictions. So I correspond a lot with local counsel in foreign countries, China, Japan, Taiwan, Argentina. So you have to, at least for patent, not only know about the USPTO laws here in the US, but you also have to kind of know the patent procedures in these other countries. And that's a lot of information to grasp and stay on top of. So your docket will kind of be your best friend because it'll tell you, hey, Jesse, you have this, you know, national stage is where you know, ask, ask for protection in other countries. And you have this coming up, and so it kind of keeps you on your toes. But I think the hardest part is like staying on top of it all when you have the kind of workload that a lot of folks in patent have. And I think for attorneys, really it's drafting the patent applications. So they'll correspond with a client, and the client will say, hey, this is our science behind it, this is what we want to do, help us draft an application. And the attorneys will literally spend 12, 13 hours in front of a screen just trying to draft patent applications. And a lot of them have chemical structures, sequence listings. So it's a lot of science behind it that I personally will never understand. Um, but I think another part too is drafting claims. And if you're familiar with IP law, you know that that's the most important part of your application. And so you kind of have to convince, wherever you're seeking protection, or the USPTO or the examiner, that these claims are, one, not repetitive, and two, they make sense, right? So, an example could be like, claim one identifies X, Y, and Z, and then claim two in favor of claim one identifies blah, blah, blah. And they just keep going and going and going. So I see a lot of headaches and a lot of cups of coffee come drafting application time around. But yeah, it's a crazy world in IP, and I think a lot of people in the legal field know that the folks that work in this are kind of crazy a little bit. I get it all the time, like, how do you do this type of stuff, or like, you're crazy for doing foreign filing, but like, it keeps me on my toes, and you learn so much. Like, um, one of my clients at Cho was Pfizer, and another one of my clients now at Wilson is Moderna. So I've seen kind of the science behind the applications and what the clients wanted to achieve or have achieved, and going forward. So it's pretty interesting stuff, and you come across a lot of things that you can relate to your own personal growth. Like, now I know this a little science about behind cRNA, which is the acronym for the COVID chemical structure. And it's just, I could go on forever. But yes, toughest part is staying on top of it all, at least for patent law, for me. And then I think for the attorneys, it's definitely drafting the applications and making it all make sense, or hoping it does.
Thanks, Jesse. Anybody else want to offer anything?
Well, I was just going to jump in just real quick. I mean, just really to quickly say what Jesse said. Deadlines are really that can be the tough thing at times, because when you're dealing with, because we deal with, when you're dealing with court deadlines, I mean, as a student, it's almost like you figure it's like you have a, it's like you have a, a term paper due on such and such a date, and then you have another class that's due, you have a paper that's due the next day, and that professor doesn't care that you have another professor, so one judge doesn't necessarily care that you have something due, whereas another judge is requiring it as well. So sometimes you do have to sort of do some juggling in terms of your caseload, and sometimes you may have to put in some late nights. That if you have something that is, you have a deadline. I mean, now with electronic filing, you can be working until midnight sometimes to file. You don't want to do that, but you can. But sometimes that you get close. So keeping track of deadlines, juggling, good organization skills, that's all really, really important.
Yeah, Lou, that's actually funny because that's pretty much exactly what I was going to say. And I'm being honest when I tell you there's still nights, even 18 years later, that I'll wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night and go, like, what did I forget? It's always like a deadline. Oh, this motion's due, or I only have 21 days. It's just, yes. So I agree wholeheartedly with you, although, meditation has helped me greatly in that regard.
Yeah, I think I would jump in and say, here's the thing about being a lawyer. People don't usually call a lawyer if they're happy about something, right? So most of the phone calls you're going to get are from people who are unhappy and are probably dealing with a really stressful thing in their life. So sometimes it's not really a happy profession, and you get used to that. I mean, the flip side of that is you are able to help a lot of people, and that's a really nice thing, and people are grateful and appreciative. But yeah, it's not really a happy profession. And I have days sometimes, I think we all sort of have these fantasy careers in mind, and my fantasy career is to be a florist. Like, I have this conception that like florists have no stress in their lives, because how stressful could it be to put together those arrangements, and which is completely ridiculous, right? But when you're a lawyer, you sometimes think about like, I wonder, if I should have like been an art major. Maybe that would have been a better way to go.
All right. So and it's funny that you say that, Rita, that it can be tough to get used to the constant negativity. And I think any kind of, I mean, I'm sure the legal field experiences it more than most, but in most cases, people are generally mad at what you're telling them as opposed to you as a person. And so sometimes it can be hard to not take that personally. But let's see, a couple other questions came in. This is a good one. So we've talked about internship opportunities, but what if you've been out of school for a little while and you're thinking about getting back into or trying to get into this workforce? Is volunteering the only type of hands-on experience that someone could offer? Or do you have any other suggestions on ways to get into the profession if it's been a little while since you've been in a class or something like that?
Yes, networking. I think that's huge, and that was a big proponent for me. I think talking to folks that that you definitely look up to, and also utilizing social media sites like LinkedIn is super, super important. LinkedIn especially, you load your profile, you connect with folks, you'll have some random connections, but you all probably share some common interest. And as weird as it may sound, reach out. You never know. Just say, hey, my name is so-and-so. I see that we've connected. Let me know if there are any ways that we can remain connected, or start a conversation. And you kind of just go through folks' profile and see what you have in common, or if you're interested. I mean, I can be transparent with you all. I think that's how I got 2 out of the 3 jobs that I've gotten outside of undergrad, is just reaching out. And it could be like, hey, can we chat to see what else we have in common? Or, hey, are you guys hiring? Like, plain and simple. Put your resume out there, put yourself out there, because you never know what you can bring to someone's life, whether that's in their, in their respective career space or in someone else's. They may know someone in the field that they can kind of connect you with. So I think networking is a super, super, super important tool to utilize, both, you know, on the media and, you know, foots on the ground type of work.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. So we just got another question that came in. Okay, a little bit of a different angle. Some advice about an individual is looking to become a mediator and having a little bit of a challenge going what appears to be somewhat of the traditional route. If anybody can talk about maybe some useful steps for becoming part of the mediation process. I don't know if anybody's involved with that at all.
You know, there are firms that that specialize in just mediation. There's one in Salem, MDRS, Mass Dispute Resolution Services, that when I used to do litigation work, which I don't anymore, we would do mediation cases through them. And there were retired judges and retired attorneys, but their list of mediators was huge. Depending on what type of case you had, you could see each mediator's background and what they specialized in and use that to help, you know, choose which mediator was right for your case. So reaching out to companies like that, you know, that's just one that I happen to know of, and finding out what their criteria are, you know, for hiring and what they're looking for in mediators. But I know, just, you know, for example, they weren't all retired lawyers and judges. They had those, but there were mediators from all different fields that, you know, you could look through, and you know, that's some place where, you know, like Jesse mentioned, just reaching out and saying, hey, are you hiring, or could we talk a little bit, you know, trying to reach out to a firm like that and asking them about, you know, what are they looking for in mediators, what are their requirements, is a great way. You know, you're never going to know until you ask. And there's never been a day where a student or somebody else has asked me a question that I said, hey, I don't have time to deal with you. It might take me a day or two to answer, but, you know, I'm going to answer. So don't be shy. Reach out to these places. That's just one that I know of, but there are a number of mediation firms like that that you should be checking into.
Thanks, Mike. So we've got, let's see. I'm graduating in a few months. I'm preparing for the LSAT and beginning to apply to law school. Any advice you can give me on that process?
Here's my very quick advice. If you're taking an LSAT prep class, even after the class is over, keep doing the exercises. I took a class, practiced a little bit, and then took the LSAT a month later, and I really had kind of, you know, I don't think I did as well as I could have if I had kept up with, you know, practicing, taking the questions, that kind of thing. So put your all into trying to do as well as possible in the LSAT, because it's going to come back to that money thing, right? The higher your LSAT score, hopefully the more money you'll get in financial aid from whatever law school you are applying to, or law schools you're applying to.
I just say in terms of taking the LSAT too, now again, I took the LSAT many years ago, but it was, but it, you know, yeah, put your all in it, just like Rita just said, you know, because I remember when I took the LSAT, I signed up for the LSAT late, so I had to go to Worcester to take it. But I did take a prep course, and I remember when I took it, I took it. I remember I was nervous. I didn't think I tested well, and I remember there was a thing where you could go, and this again ages me, because if you didn't want your test to count, you could send a telegram to the LSAT people to go and cancel your score if you sent the telegram by midnight. So I was thinking, should I do that? I mean, where is even a Western Union place to send a telegram? And as it turned out, I did okay. I did fine. You know, I did fine. I did better than I thought. And so, but again, I kept through the test questions. I just sort of kept it up, and I applied to a bunch of different law schools. And so that was, and I had a broad geographic scope too. So I ended up going to school in DC. So I was interested. I'd spent my whole life up in Boston. I was in the Boston area. I was interested in going someplace a little further out. So it was good.
Thanks, Lou. So we'll take one more question, and then we'll get into our actual final question, which I'm going to reserve for myself. So for those folks that have taken part in the law school experience, what was the most challenging about it for you?
Well, law school is pretty challenging in and of itself. At the time, like I said, I was working during the day. I was going to school at night. I also got married and had a baby my first year of law school. So that presented its own challenges. But, scholastically, just like anything else, there's a lot of reading and a lot of writing. And certainly there has to be some time management factored into that because, in law school, um, you're all there because you want to be there, but, there really isn't any mercy from the professors coming your way. So being prepared is super important in law school. So trying to make sure that you have time to get all your readings done and all your outlines done and, um, being ready to speak in class because chances are they're going to call on you. And, you can't go into it without having read the night before, like maybe you could swing that and other, forms of education. So I think just making the time to make sure that you have, you can really absorb what you're reading and what you're writing and that you're ready to talk when you're in class because they will call on you.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. So it's just a few minutes shy of the hour, so I'm going to pose this as the last question to the group, and also offer any closing advice that you'd like to include before we wrap up for this evening. But in looking where you are in your careers now, if you could go back and change anything about the path you've taken thus far, would you? And if so, what would you do differently? Everybody's loving what they did so far. Nobody wants
Mike,
to.
if you want, I'm thinking about because on the one hand, I want to say, no, I wouldn't change anything because I, wouldn't. I'm happy where I am, but maybe it took me longer to get here than if I could, go back and change things now. In law school, they teach you about theory and cases, but at least when I went, they didn't teach you very much about running a practice or how to run a business. So if anything, I wished that even if it meant me taking a separate class somewhere, just learning about things like payroll and insurance and, that sort of thing was something that when I went out on my own and opened my own practice was really kind of a shock to deal with that stuff. The other thing is that if whether you're going to work for yourself or for somebody else, realizing how important marketing is, it's something that I wish I had realized earlier. I've grown probably more in the last 3 years than in the previous 10 because I figured out how important marketing is and figuring out a way to market my firm. So if I could change anything, I would have dug into marketing a lot sooner than I did.
My professional career path is so short. It's only been almost 3 years now. But I think if I had to change something, I probably would have started out in intellectual property. And that's not to say I didn't enjoy my time as an assistant in the healthcare practice because I did support the chair of the healthcare team. So I saw like pretty much everything. I just think that while it offered me great law firm experience, I didn't learn anything substantive that I could have, carried on to the next endeavor. Besides, how to work in a law firm or what it's like to work in a law firm or what it's like to support, partners or senior counsel or whatever the case may be. But I think, right now I'm doing foreign filing in intellectual property. I would like to also do US prosecution as well. And I think that if I had started out as like an IP assistant, I would have gotten that prosecution experience just because a lot of the assistants now in that space also file as well. They don't do foreign filing unless they're a foreign filing assistant. They mainly do US prosecution. But I think, my skill set would have been a bit more rounded. But that is a plan to, dip into US prosecution. But I really enjoy foreign prosecution because I kind of see it all. And you get to see how annoying some of these patent offices are with their formal documents and all that stuff. Advice, I would say to not sell yourself to corporate, um, because it can be very stressful. And I was super involved in Salem State, and I think I credit a lot of my ability to effectively time manage and work well under pressure to that, because I was involved so much and I still was able to take 5 to 6 courses a semester. Um, so I think that sort of preparation, while I wasn't thinking about it as preparation because, I wanted to go right to law school, I do credit my time there to being able to kind of juggle multiple tasks and still being, moderately successful in my personal work. So think long and hard about what you want to do, but just know that there isn't a path that you must follow, that you can drift off to your initial path and still end up in a great path or a successful one that works for you. So just remember that.
And I want to jump in too, just in terms of advice and sort of picking up on what Jesse was saying too. I mean, don't be afraid to sort of change things up as well. And I've had, even though I've practiced in a similar area of the law in my career, I mean, I've gone from one agency to another. I mean, it's one sector to another in terms of working for public interest, so of nonprofit to government, and so there's definitely parts of me that think, oh, maybe if I just stuck in one area, stuck in that one, I could be like some of these government attorneys who've been in the same. I have a friend who's been in the same agency since he got out of law school. I mean, for 30 something years, and I certainly could have done that, but I think that I don't think I would have had the breadth of experiences and really picked up a lot of different things if I hadn't done that. And I think that, and I think also just, it's also never too late either. I mean, I also did a change in job. We moved from DC back to Massachusetts. I was 48 years old after being practicing over 20 years. I mean, that's a long, and then you feel, even though you're in a new place and you're hired and you're sort of a lateral, so you're hired at a good level, you still feel like you're a kid. You're the new kid on the block. So it takes a little while to get out of that. But if doing that is actually, it can be a little scary, but it's good to do. So you shouldn't be afraid of that. At least I try to tell myself that.
All right. Any other last closing thoughts before we wrap up for the night?
Well, I just want to say to Jesse that you appear to be so interested in what you're doing, and I think that's really wonderful. And I think you should go to law school.
Maybe right now it's a hard no.
Okay.
But I mean, you're not the first person to tell me that, so I thank you. I appreciate it. But it's a lot to think about, and I want to at least hone my skills to the T with everything that is IP, because I can probably say this now. I probably wouldn't go to law school with the intent to be a patent attorney, just because STEM has never been my thing. But like many of you mentioned, you don't have to know exactly what you want to practice in, so that's good. I will take your comments into consideration.
Learn about it.
Any other final thoughts before we wrap up for the evening? All right. Well, listen, Stephanie, Rita, Jesse, Mike, and Lou, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope our audience enjoyed the presentation as well. If anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact the Alumni Association. You can email alumni@salemstate.edu. Based on the feedback from this program, this is something that we'll certainly offer again in the future. So thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.